Good Chodesh. Good morning. We are on Chaf Vav Amud Beis 26b toward the bottom. We're in the middle of a very interesting discussion. It's one way to put it, I suppose. And where we are is as follows. The Torah said, describing the person about which this woman is being warned, that begins the Sotah process. The Torah says that the intimacy is, or the activity between the two of them is, shichva zera, a laying that produces seed. That's how the Gemara described. That's how the Torah described it. Now, Shmuel told us that a shachuf, a person who is incapable of complete sexual activity, so he doesn't actually produce seed, this person still counts as one who a husband can warn about. Right? So if a husband warned his wife not to seclude herself with a shachuf, this person is incapable of complete sexual activity, and then she violates that warning, she's a Sotah, even though he's incapable of producing seed. If that's the case, then what is the meaning of the verse which says, shichva zera, that they're laying a laying that produces seed? If the shachuf counts as this person that she's with, that causes a problem and makes her a Sotah, and this shachuf cannot actually produce any seed. So what is the meaning of the verse which says that he's warning her against being with a man who's going to lay with her in seed? If anyways, the guy can't produce seed and it still counts. So therefore it must come to exclude some other activity. So, which means like this, shichva zera, the laying of seed, does not mean that it actually produces seed, but it means appropriate normative sexual activity, which ordinarily would produce seed, even though this guy can't. So what exactly is that? And to the exclusion of what? So we went through a number of scenarios. First option is, well, maybe it's coming to exclude anal sexuality, right? So if he warns her and says, do not seclude yourself with such and such a guy, because I'm concerned you're going to do X, and that X is anal, or what they call it, shalaikadarka, the abnormal way of activity. But if it is ordinary intercourse, even though it doesn't produce seed, it still counts. That's the shachuf. That the Gemara rejected because elsewhere, when it comes to homosexuality, the Torah compares homosexuality to mishkevei isha, the laying of a woman. And with homosexuality, it's only shalaikadarka, it's only in the inappropriate way. There is no other penetration. And thus, those two organs have equal legal classification. And therefore, if it's a problem that he's with her, ordinary intercourse, then it's an equal problem if he's with her in the abnormal intercourse. So that can't be what's excluded from shichva zera, because that too counts as shichva zera. That too counts as laying the seed, because the Torah compares those two organs together. So then we suggested, okay, maybe it's coming to exclude what the Gemara referred to as derech evarim, a sexual activity using other limbs. So not the organs of sexuality per se, but other limbs, let you use your imagination. I'm not going to give you details.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So any other limb that isn't a sexual organ per se. So maybe that's what's being excluded from shichva zera. That's what's being excluded from the seeding, laying with her of seed. In other words, like this. Perhaps it would mean like this. If he warns her and says, don't seclude yourself with such and such a guy, I'm concerned you're going to do X. And that X does not include those two sexual organs, the two orifices of sexuality, as we just described before, ordinary intercourse and anal. It doesn't include that, some other organ. So perhaps if she violates that warning, she's not a Sotah, because it doesn't constitute as shichva zera, the laying of seed. That's what the Gemara suggested. And the Gemara rejected that also, because the Gemara said considering that it doesn't include any of her sexual organs. It doesn't constitute sexual activity on her part at all. It's what's called pritutza ba'alma. It's just random frivolity.
It doesn't include other sexual organs?
It doesn't. Not on her part. Her part only has 2 sexual organs, right? Those 2 orifices.
What about
anything else doesn't constitute. By Torah law, doesn't count as those 2. Let me put it this way: the legal rubric of what sexual organ is if she was, let's say, we know as a matter of fact she engaged in that activity, is she now forbidden to live with her husband? So if she was lay with a man with one of those 2 orifices, then she's forbidden to be with her husband. If it's any other organ, she's not forbidden to be with her husband. It's totally wrong, and she shouldn't do it. Then it's pritzos, what the Gemara calls it. It's horrible promiscuity, but it doesn't constitute sexual activity on her body to the point that she can't live with her husband. If that's the case, that's not even on the table. That has to be excluded from the verse. So when the verse says, right, that he lay with her, that when he's warning her for the Sotah, he's warning her about laying with a man for laying of seeding, and it has to be, it can't be complete seeding, because we said the shachaf already, the guy who's not capable of complete sexual activity, he too constitutes a Sotah. And so what is it excluding? What are we limiting? Why would the Torah add that description to tell us only the laying of seeding is a violation of Sotah, but not another one? What's that other one? It can't be any other organs, because those other limbs don't count as sexual activity on her part, even though it's frivolous and terrible and pritzis and all the rest of it. Clear? This is where we are right now.
The Gemara is rejecting the other organs. They're saying
that's right.
There too, you could be a Sotah.
No, the Gemara is suggesting it by saying you're not a Sotah at all. It's so far removed from sexual activity on her part that it wouldn't even need to be excluded from the verse. In other words, like this: we have to find something which ordinarily is referred to as sexual activity, but here the verse is excluding it by saying the words laying of seed. So you have to find something in the middle here, something which is sexual activity, and that would cause a problem in their marriage legally because she did that. But that activity is being excluded from the words shichva zera, laying of seed. That's why we're stuck in the middle here. You following? If it's something that is just bona fide sexual activity, okay, then why shouldn't that make her a Sotah? And if it's something that's not sexual activity at all, then why does it have to be excluded from the verse? It's not part of it anyway. So you have to find something in the middle, right? So
what we're saying is that there is lewd activity that is not sexual activity.
it's a lewd activity, but doesn't constitute a sexual infidelity on her part.
Okay, right.
To the point that she's now forbidden to be with her husband. So it's outside of the parameters of infidelity,
right,
on the legal sense, even though, of course, on the moral sense, it's totally wrong, and they should probably go to therapy, maybe they should divorce, I don't know. But in terms of the legalities of it, what's the legal rubric?
But so how does it, so at what point did just a graze of skin or just like the slightest, like a handshake? Or
So that's what we're going, well, that's a good question. In other words, there's hilchos tznius, there's laws of modesty,
right,
and then there's a huge spectrum in the laws of modesty.
right.
Not talking, not looking, not touching,
Touching where,
touching how, in what context. I mean, there's a huge spectrum, and you got to discuss that with your wife and your mashpia. No, I mean it. I mean it.
Right.
A person should have an open, honest conversation with his wife about that kind of thing. And certainly, there's the Orthodox standard, there's the Chabad standard, right? And the person has to be.
And to what level of kin are you open to?
The first rule is have rules. That's the first rule. Not like, oh, it's no big deal, everything's fine. I can, hug my husband, my wife, my friend's wife. It's no big deal. Because I'm married, right? I'm happily married. Don't be foolish like that. Have rules. Exactly. Have rules. Because I have a newsflash for you. We're men and we're behemoths. Behemoths is Yiddish/Hebrew for animals. Or at least we have an animal within us. And the first thing is you want to be able to control the animal in you is to acknowledge that it's there.
Right.
You make as if it's not there. It's no big deal for me.
Right.
Yeah. That's the day you're going to fall. Anyway, okay. Sorry. But over here, we're not talking about that. Over here, we're talking about the legal activity of infidelity to the point that now she's forbidden to live with her husband. Right? So if it's something that's out of that realm, then that can't be excluded from the verse of the Sotah law, because it doesn't count as infidelity to begin with. But if it's full-on intercourse, then it can't be excluded from the Sotah because that's infidelity. So you have to find the middle ground, which ordinarily does constitute infidelity and ordinarily does constitute a sexual activity. But the Torah says laying of seeding in the Sotah to tell you that this activity is not part of it. So what exactly is that activity? Yeah. Right. So the last suggestion we left off with yesterday is from Abaye, which said genital contact. No penetration, but general contact. Okay, this is where we left off now. So that's the kind of activity which ordinarily would constitute infidelity, and therefore they can't live together, right? But because the law of the Sotah says laying of seeding, that activity is excluded, even though ordinarily it is considered infidelity. Clear?
So to make that on your previous point,
Yeah.
did you say that a person, I don't know what they call the back of noses, let's say vasectomy, or somebody who's not able to produce
that's the shachov,
seed,
right?
Yeah.
Shmuel told us that the shachov is included in the Sotah law.
You're still doing
So
it,
that's
still
right.
intercourse.
Exactly. So the laying of seeding doesn't mean that there's actual production of seed per se, because the shachov can't produce seed.
Right.
It means that the activity they're doing constitute as laying of seeding, even if it doesn't actually produce seed. But what's the classification of that activity?
Right.
And if the classification of that activity is laying of seeding, let's say the guy does complete intercourse, but doesn't actually seed in her.
Right.
That doesn't count as infidelity because he didn't actually produce seed, right? But it's still a laying of seeding, right? So the question is, what's the legal definition of that? So you already said any sort of ordinary intercourse penetration, even if it doesn't include seeding, counts.
Right.
And so is it true with anal? It also counts,
right?
Because that's considered a laying of seeding, because the Torah compared the two, right? If it's any in any of those two orifices,
okay.
Right? If it's any other organ of the body, so it's totally wrong frivolity and lewd behavior, but doesn't constitute a sexual activity on her part because it didn't include her sexual organs, and thus doesn't count as infidelity that would render her forbidden to your husband. Wow. So we have to find an activity that does include we have to find an activity which does count, as I was telling you this morning. Come to the class today, you'll see Terry doesn't leave anything off the table.
It wouldn't violate husband's warning.
So
right?
A warning in that case, we have to find the case like this, where ordinarily that activity does count as infidelity. And therefore, ordinarily that activity, if we were to know that this actually happened, she would have to divorce her husband. She would not be able to live with her because that counts as infidelity. And yet it doesn't satisfy, quote, laying of seed. And that way, and therefore, a warning about such an activity would not make her Sotah. Because the Torah limits the warning of Sotah to shikva zera, laying of seed. Okay. So we have to find something which ordinarily is considered infidelity, but is not laying of seed. So yesterday, Abaye suggested that is genital contact without penetration. So genital contact without penetration ordinarily would constitute infidelity because it's an activity with the sexual organ. And therefore, ordinarily, if we were to know for sure that that's what happened, she would have to separate from her husband. But because it's not laying of seed, because there's no penetration, therefore it doesn't work. A warning about such an activity would not make her Sotah. Because when it comes to Sotah, the Torah says the warning has to be about laying of seed. And genital contact is not laying of seed, even though ordinarily it's considered infidelity.
So if a woman secludes,
Clear?
So if a woman secludes herself for general contact purposes.
Well, we don't know what happened behind closed door. The question is how he warned her. When he warned her, he said to her, I'm warning you against secluding yourself with such men because I think you're going to have genital contact. Or I'm warning you against being with this guy to the point of genital contact. So if he articulates that in his warning, he kind of ruined his warning, right? He qualified his warning. Now the question is
a special case, right?
Exactly. In other words, if he just said, don't seclude yourself with that woman, then she'd be a Sotah. Doesn't matter what she did behind closed doors, because we actually don't even know what happened behind closed doors, which is why she's a Sotah. But the question is, if he put a caveat to his warning about a certain activity, is that activity considered something that upheld the Sotah law, or does it undermine the Sotah law?
In other words, if she had general contact behind closed doors,
we wouldn't know.
But
oh, would the waters of the Sotah cause her?
And he qualified his warning to include general contact.
He specifically.
She would have to drink.
No, so Abai is saying no. If he warned her and qualified his warning, that I'm warning you against secluding yourself with such a man
General contact,
because of genital contact.
not general.
Genital.
Is that what you're saying? Oh,
Yes, genital contact.
General.
No, genital. I'm being.
But the same thing.
No, but genital contact is different. Shaking a hand is not the same thing.
No, what I
Big difference in general.
No, I meant
Genital
general
contact.
prohibited contact in my mind.
No. So he meant genital contact specifically.
No.
So he warns her and says, this is the scenario. He warns her and says, do not seclude yourself with that guy because I'm concerned of genital contact, or warning you don't have genital contact with that guy. That's the warning he gives her. Yeah. So Abaye is saying, if she went ahead and secluded herself with that guy, you have no idea what to do behind closed doors. We haven't a clue. But because his warning was qualified by an activity that is not laying of seed, she is not a Sotah. Because his warning had no value. Because his warning was excluded from the verse when the verse says laying of seed.
So is that to say?
Following? Even though if there was no Sotah, we just know that she would have genital contact with so-and-so. That would be considered unfaithful, and she would have to divorce her husband. But when it comes to the Sotah law, that doesn't count. Such a warning about such an activity doesn't make her into a Sotah.
So he blew it by saying.
That's correct. He ruined it by putting a qualifier. That's right.
Because now, even if she had
Full on.
he wasn't warning her.
He didn't warn her properly. That's correct.
What if he included everything?
So just don't say anything. Just say, I'm warning you against secluding yourself with another guy, period. Just leave it alone without saying anything. But he ruined it by saying that. Following?
So I have a question.
That's one way to think about it. I have another way to think about it, then I'll send a second. First, ask your question. Yeah.
I hung up on this issue I said before. I think I'm sure I understand it wrong. But so let's say the man says, a woman is put to the Sotah and she says, were you
Unfaithful?
Yeah, unfaithful to another man? And she says, no, it was only oral sex.
Let's say she says that.
Yeah.
So she wouldn't qualify. That's a good question. She wouldn't, does she drink the Sotah waters at that point? It's a good question. I don't know the answer. I don't know. But that doesn't constitute as unfaithful. She wouldn't have to do, if there are witnesses to that effect, let's say.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Then she wouldn't be forced to divorce her husband. She might have to because obviously they have marital issues, but from legally speaking, she would not be forbidden to be with her husband.
Because that's under
because it's not under the rubric of sexual activity on her part.
Right.
Because it did not include her sexual organ.
Yeah. Wow.
Or one of those two orifices.
Right.
Yeah.
Huh.
Oh, so the other way to think about it is I haven't seen this written anywhere, but I think this might be another way of thinking about it. Let's say he warned her ordinarily, a normal warning.
General warning.
Don't seclude yourself with such a man. Now she did. We don't know what happened behind closed doors. She now says she's a Sotah. So she drinks the Sotah water. Now the Sotah water is supposed to tell us whether she was unfaithful or not. Right?
Yeah.
Now let's say all she did was genital contact. Will the Sotah water give her harm or not?
I think that was kind of my question.
So that might be another way of thinking about this. Because when it comes to Sotah, the Torah, I don't think, I could see why this might be wrong, this way of thinking, but it's a possible another way of thinking about it. Because the Sotah law specifically states it has to be the laying of seed, and this was not laying of seed, then all the Sotah doesn't apply to her, including the effects of the drinking of the water, maybe.
I always thought when we were going through this analysis that whether the Sotah applies or not is whether or not she even has to drink or not as opposed to the consequence.
Yes, it does. That's right. But the drinking is not based on what she did, because we don't know what she did. The drinking is based on what the husband said. Was his warning a valid warning or not? That's why I was saying that it's a question of him ruining it by adding that qualifier. Because that's right. Because in order for the seclusion to be considered to turn her into a Sotah, it has to be a violation of a warning he gave her. Right? Now, if the warning he gave her was not right for a Sotah law, then her violating it won't turn her into a Sotah. So if he qualified that warning with an activity that doesn't work for Sotah, then even if she included herself and she had full penetration, you have no idea because it was closed out behind closed doors, but she still wouldn't be a Sotah because he ruined it and not giving her a proper warning.
But that other issue is about what happens to her.
I'm not sure about that, but I could.
And she only had genital contact.
I'm not 100% sure about it, but I could think that perhaps it would be the same discussion. Yeah. Okay, but it comes down to really the main issue here is the warning. The main issue here is how he qualifies his warning. that when he qualifies his warning, if he qualifies it at about a certain activity, which is excluded from the Sotah law, then the Sotah law is off. She doesn't go to drink. Because the Sotah only happens when she violates his warning. So his warning must be proper. If his warning is, I'm warning you against genital contact with that guy, then that doesn't constitute a Sotah warning.
It seems like you're.
Because there has to be a warning specific to the laying of seed.
In this framework,
Yeah.
are the women aware of this? Like, how is this is the Torah
Maybe yes,
thing?
maybe no, it doesn't matter. But the question is when the case comes before the court
Oh, okay.
and we have witnesses tell us we heard this guy warn that one. Right? So the Bezdin will ask, what did he say? If it's the exact words of his warning. And if the exact words of the warning don't qualify for this, we say, sorry, Sotah law's off.
The Bezdin needs to know.
That's right. The Bezdin, when it does its investigation, has to find out what were the circumstances of this warning.
But perhaps it can encourage a woman to be promiscuous, knowing that she won't qualify.
As a Sotah.
Yeah.
Well, there are other consequences to the behaviors you were describing, right? It's just not the Sotah law, right? That's what I'm saying. Just because something is not qualified as Sotah doesn't make it a good behavior.
Right.
Right?
Exactly.
It's a question of legality,
Right.
not a question.
Like, let's say, just because your stomach isn't going to explode and have a gut fever, it doesn't mean that
that this
not
is a good
other
thing to
bad
do.
things.
Exactly.
Or that it's good.
Exactly. Hashem will do his thing, but this is a question.
Right.
Okay, so this is where we left off. So just to bring us where we are, if his warning was qualified by, I'm warning you against genital contact, then because that does not constitute as laying of seed, this is not a warning that would render her a Sotah. This was Abaye's suggestion.
So the Beit did ask him these questions prior to proceeding with the Sotah.
Precisely. Remember, we learned that after the warning, the first thing is she brings him to the local court, and if the local court determines that she's actually a Sotah, then they send they take two scholars and accompany them up to the temple.
So they're gonna
Right.
ask
So
him
that first
questions.
court has to go through the whole. What was the warning? How was it? Was it done correctly? Were the witnesses not witnesses? How many witnesses? What they know? What they don't know? All these details,
Right.
including what was the warning? What was the exact language of the
Exact
warning?
wording of his warning.
Exactly. Precisely. Okay. So now let's see where we are now. The Gemara says like this: the whole premise of Abaye's argument, which is that if his warning is about genital contact, it fails Sotah because it's not laying of seed. That's all premised on the fact that ordinarily this does count as infidelity. Because again, like you said, like if it's a question of he warned her against oral sex, let's say, right? So if that's what he warned her against, that doesn't qualify as a Sotah at all, because it's not considered the kind of activity that would ordinarily make her divorce, right? Or ordinarily make her forbidden to her husband. So Abaye is looking for an activity which ordinarily would make her unfaithful, but because in the Sotah law it says laying of seed, it doesn't constitute.
So in other words, she'd still be actionable for divorce. And
If she was actually caught with witnesses of genital contact.
Yeah.
So we have to look at that law and see is that the case.
There's no orders to prove her innocence.
That's right. So now the question becomes, is it indeed true that that genital contact constitutes unfaithfulness in Torah? That becomes a question now. Is that indeed the case?
Were such things done in public settings in those times?
What
For there to be witnesses? And
Well, there could be a
whether it happened then or happens not the question. This is all theoretical. It could be, hopefully it never happened,
right.
but the law still remains true in the what if, the theoretical, right? Okay, so now let's see where we are. So again, the Abaye's argument is based on the fact
Something actionable for
that
fidelity.
if putting Sotah law aside, if there were witnesses to the effect that there was genital contact, she would have to divorce, she would have to separate from her husband. Or if she was being an honest woman and wanted to follow Torah law, if there was genital contact with another man, she would be forbidden to her husband. That's the premise, right? But because the Torah here says laying of seed, it's not part of the Sotah law, but ordinarily would constitute as infidelity, right? Now let's analyze.
Different law.
Right. So now let's look at this. Is this indeed the case? Is it true, putting Sotah law aside, is it true that genital contact renders her forbidden to her husband? Is that indeed true? That's the foundation of the whole argument of Abaye. Following? Yeah. And it turns out it's actually a dispute. It's actually a dispute as to whether or not genital contact constitutes infidelity. Specifically, the verse reads, which reads as follows. Every time I move this page, it becomes unclear. I don't know why that is. Okay. The verse reads as follows. When it comes to all questions of forbidden sexual relationships, the Torah uses the word as makoida hera. This word hera, which means he uncovered her source, meaning her nakedness, her genitalia.
Right.
So what does it mean that he opened it? What does it mean that he hera? He like unveiled it. What does it mean?
He wrote there.
Does it? How far? Just because you happen to be undressed and he didn't touch her, but she's undressed, and that constitutes as unfaithfulness. So what? At which point exactly does that become ha'ara? At what point?
To see a naked woman.
No. To be unfaithful, to violate the prohibition of sexual activity with so and so. The Torah lists a whole bunch of relationships that are forbidden. At what point did you violate that prohibition? Not when she's undressed.
Oh, okay.
So at which point did you violate? What comes down to what's the definition of this word? Ha'ara. He uncovered. What is the definition of that? Obviously, that doesn't just mean take her clothes off. That's not unfaithfulness. It's terrible. It's not unfaithfulness, right? It doesn't violate the prohibition of that intimacy. Right? Torah says a person's not allowed to be with his sister. So at what point did he violate that? Right? At which point? Does it have to be complete intercourse all the way to the end or not? Or this, that? So generally speaking, there are three stages. For the purposes of our discussion. There's genital contact without penetration. There's the beginning of penetration, which is just I think it's called the corona, the part of the male organ that where the bris is.
Yeah, so. Corona.
Corona, yeah. They call it in Torah language, they call it atara, the crown.
Okay, yeah.
But there's an English word for it, and it's corona. So that's not complete penetration, but it's a beginning of penetration. That's stage 2, and stage 3 is complete penetration, even without production of seed. It means like a pubic contact, basically, full penetration. Those are the 3 stages. So which stage did she violate? Well, it doesn't have it can be just for complete penetration, because the Torah says hera, uncovered, which is even less than complete penetration. But how much constitutes uncovering? So there's a dispute. One opinion says uncovering is the insertion of the corona, or let's call it the crown. That constitutes as a violation. But genital contact is of no consequence. Genital contact does not constitute a violation of forbidden sexual activity. Now, if that's the case, then we're back to square one. Abaye's whole argument is that this activity called genital contact is usually cause for divorce because it's considered unfaithfulness. When it comes to the Sotah, it's excluded. But according to one opinion, that doesn't even constitute as a violation for infidelity because there was no penetration at all, not even the crown. Clear? So we're back to square one. According to that opinion, what is the activity which constitutes unfaithfulness, but yet is excluded from the Sotah law because the law says the laying of seed.
Yeah, but then again, now we're looking at what they did behind closed doors. And
Again, we're talking about the warning. But we have to
Sorry.
make it clear. We're talking about the warning, right?
Okay.
But the question is the warning, that the words he's using when he describes the warning. What is that activity? It never happened. But what is the activity he's describing? Is the activity he's describing something that would make her unfaithful?
But he doesn't say, he's general. He just says.
But
general
what if he
contact.
does? What if he does specify in his warning? Again, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about where he specifies in his warning a specific activity. And the question is that activity considered something that would make her unfaithful? Would that constitute as seeding of man? Not what happened behind closed doors, because what happened behind closed doors we don't know. But his warning, right?
Okay, but it's a dispute, so.
Oh, so the dispute now whether or not genital contact constitutes at all of unfaithfulness. So let's see. All makes sense. Lamanda Amar, according to the view that when the verse says that violation of forbidden sexual relations, and the verse uses ha'ara that he uncovered. Zuhach nasasatara. This is. I get it wrong. This is when the crown enters.
It's the middle ground.
But avol nashika. But if it's just genital contact, the like klum, it's of no consequence. I'm sorry, I got it backwards. I'm sorry. I said before that I got it wrong before. I said before that if genital contact serves as unfaithfulness, that's why it's being excluded from the verse. That's wrong. Because if it's considered unfaithfulness, then it's the same thing as anal, which is considered full-on unfaithfulness, and therefore must be included in the Sotah law. So it has to be right in the border, just outside of unfaithfulness. So if you're of the view that that insertion of the corona of the crown that constitutes unfaithfulness, then genital contact is just in the border, and that's what's being excluded from the verse.
How is it on the border?
Because it's just about to be unfaithful, not actual unfaithfulness.
Right.
So, this is why the verse comes along and says, Lamuti Nishika, to exclude and say that if his warning is defined by genital contact, it doesn't constitute as a Sotah, even though you're almost at unfaithfulness. But according to the view which says that genital contact itself constitutes as sexual activity, then that means genital contact, as far as the law's unfaithfulness goes, is the same thing as full penetration. So, Michael Amemar, how could you say that the verse is excluding that from the Sotah law? The Sotah law is him warning her against being unfaithful. If the definition of being unfaithful is genital contact, then that's a perfect warning.
So what if you're in a Beit Din that has one opinion and that says general contact is enough to constitute a Beit Din, and you have another Beit Din who rules that.
But by the time we get to the Bezdin today, they already have a ruling. But this is the Gemara going through the exercise of how we get to the ruling.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's do this. And this is to a point you made. So, Michael, remember, what could you say? The Gemara says, in truth, if he warned her against other limbs besides the two sexual orifices, he warned her about other limbs. He warned her about other limbs. Now, we said earlier that doesn't constitute unfaithfulness. So obviously, it's not part of the Sotah law. Why would I think it is part of the Sotah law? Why would the verse come after to exclude it? Right? The verse says he warned her about the laying of seed. We already established earlier that if it's not in those two orifices, it doesn't constitute as laying of seed. It doesn't constitute as unfaithfulness at all. So why would it be excluded from the verse? Why would I think otherwise? Yeah. She says the Gemara, you might have made the mistake of thinking, and this is something you mentioned yesterday, the Kepeda, the Baal, Talia Rahmana. Because the whole Sotah law is based on the fact that he is jealous of her, so maybe it doesn't make a difference what constitutes legally as unfaithful. The question is, what bothers him? And if sexual activity that's not from other organs bothers him, then the warning is valid. That's what I would have thought. Ubal, the husband, hakakapit, he does care about such behavior, obviously. And this is the question. See, till now we've been fighting with ourselves. The Sotah law, or the definition of his warning, must fall into some legal rubric of what constitutes unfaithfulness. If that's the case, we were stuck in this bind. If it's not considered unfaithfulness at all, then obviously it's not part of the Sotah law. It doesn't have to be excluded. If it is considered unfaithfulness, then definitely it's part of the Sotah law. So we found this thing called genital contact, according to one opinion, that says it's not actual unfaithfulness, but it's on the border of unfaithfulness, and that's what's being excluded by the law, by the statement, seeding of man. Yeah. But now the Gemara is saying, forget whether it's a legal rubric of unfaithfulness. The Sotah law has nothing to do with whether it's legally unfaithfulness. It has to do with, does he care or not?
Right.
So I would have, right? It has to do with whether he cares or not. And because I care, whether it constitutes unfaithfulness or not is irrelevant. I care. And if the warning is valid, that's what I would have mistakenly thought. Yes. Kamash Malon.
So his feeling about it
is irrelevant. And that's why the Torah says this laying of seed. The warning must be specific to the legalities of laying of seed, not based on your personal subjective experience, whether you care or not. It's exactly the point. Instead of trying to find a legal thing we're excluding, the Gemara concludes by saying we're excluding a misunderstanding of how Sotah law works. It's true Sotah law comes down to your warning, but not based on your own subjective experience of what you like or don't like. But it comes down to the legalities of what's considered unfaithful, which is why the Torah adds those words. He warns her about the seeding of the laying of seed, to teach you that the warning must be in the legal rubric of unfaithfulness, not your subjective feelings of what you care about and don't care about. Now the Gemara doesn't, this is the end of the Gemara. I'll stop over here. I'm just going to comment, maybe Why is it that the Torah did this way? Why didn't the Torah do it based on the way the person, why didn't the Torah do it based on the way the husband cares? So perhaps
People cannot care.
two things. Number one, some people might not care about unfaithfulness. They might not care about unfaithfulness. And the Gemara and the Torah is saying, no, that's a line you can't cross. You have to make a sotah.
But you have to care.
And
You don't care, something's wrong with you.
on the other hand,
But the law is saying it's irrelevant in the sense.
exactly. I'm asking.
Because even if you don't care, there's a standard
Bidiyuk.
that
There's a
you
stand.
have to follow.
That's right. There's a standard for sotah, irrespective of how you care. And moreover, if we left it to the subjective experience of the husband, you can have some
Maybe he's
extreme jealous
hypersensitive.
husband and says, "You shook her hand. You shook his hand."
Yeah.
That's not how it works. Not to leave every guy to decide how he wants to make his wife a sotah. These are the laws of the sotah. This is the definition, the legal definition. Either you're inside of it or you're outside of it. It's the beginning of the story. Your subjective experience is not relevant. That's the chidush. That's taught to us by these two words, shikva zera, the seeding of man. Because it's not for those two words, I might have thought it's subject to his personal experience, his personal feeling. So this is the end of this very graphic discussion. We're going to remind ourselves, like I remembered this yesterday, it's Hashem's Torah. And Hashem's Torah doesn't leave out any part of the human experience, even the most base of them. Because if it exists in the world, God has an opinion of how and what and where and when. Tomorrow, God willing, we're going to get into a very interesting discussion. Is it better to have a mother-in-law who is vocal about her personal life, or better to have a wife who's vocal about her personal life? Which one's worse? Which one's better? That, God willing, coming tomorrow. It's going to be a very interesting discussion. Okay, have a wonderful day, and a good Chodesh, and
Good Chodesh, Rabbi.
Oh, Judge.
yeah.
Good day. Good
What were you going to say, Robert? Sorry.
So is it a cliffhanger then in terms of the?
No, this is the end of the
The
discussion.
husband, no, I know, but I'm just saying, I understood.
Yeah.
Saying the husband who warns for genital contact, that's still
That still qualifies it. Oh, that would be a dispute whether it constitutes as.
So what is?
Well, the law. Okay, the law
what
is
lady do with
the law
that?
is that it's not considered. It's not considered
She's not a
infidelity.
Sotah. She must be a Sotah.
She wouldn't be certain. That's right.
But she may.
You may have to be divorced, whatever. Yeah, exactly. Okay, have a wonderful day. Good Chodesh.
All the very best to you, Rabbi. Go from strength to strength.
Thank you.
Amen.
Take care. All the very best to you, Yehoshua, and all of you. Thank you.
Coach Tov.
Thank you, Holy Tov. God bless you all. Thank you. Rabbi, the detail with which you treat this is absolutely remarkable. The angels and the details, and the way that you paskin in the most remarkable way, how you bring this out, is really a wonderful experience, and being able to see how evidence has to be nuanced to such a degree that nothing is missed.
Yep.
And it's to be able to have that type of evidentiary element of introspection is so important to ensure that any decision on any issue in life is brought to bear with regard to such profound introspection.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
You should go from strength to strength. All the very best to you all. We're very fortunate, Rabbi, to have you. God bless you. Doing what you're doing. Thank you. All the best. God bless you.